Hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. Boris Johnson is visiting Scotland today, highlighting what he calls the might of the UK Union. But behind his visit lies a worrying truth. The UK's devolved nations, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, have asserted greater independence during the pandemic and appear more competent than the government in Westminster to boot. In Scotland, opinion polls show a consistent majority in favour of independence. In Wales too, support for independence is growing. Are we watching the United Kingdom unravel before our eyes? Today we've got a panel of three expert commentators. David Torrance is a constitutional expert and political biographer. He's going to say a few words at the start of our talk, as I know he's got another appointment shortly. Hello, David, where are you?
I'm in Hackney in North London, where the weather is not quite as good as it was, but shaping up.
And what's the internet connection like? That's the crucial thing.
Well, in this part of the house, it's fine, which is why I've moved here. In other parts of the house, it's like 1990s dialogue quality. So yeah, you have to choose your location very carefully.
Right. Okay, well, thank you, David. And we've got Melanie McDonagh. She's a leader writer with the Evening Standard based in London, but currently in Ireland, I think, Melanie, and on an iPhone.
That's right, and former leader writer, parted ways when George Osborne was a year in the job, but a leader writer for many years, yeah.
Very great, excellent. Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Really looking forward to your contribution. And then last and certainly not least is Magnus Llewellin, who's the editor of The Times in Scotland. Where are you, Magnus? And there's a lot going on today, isn't there?
There is, Nick, yeah. I'm speaking to you from the Scottish borders near Melrose, where I've been hunkered down since the pandemic really struck. And hopefully my broadband is okay. We'll wait and see.
And who's been contributing to your paper today?
Well, we've had Boris Johnson making the case for the union. He may not like the cartoon we've got that goes alongside it, which shows the union crumbling under his feet. But yeah, he's in Lossiemouth today, and we'll touch on his flying visit and what that symbolises throughout the next hour, I'm sure.
Great. Well, we've got a fantastic discussion. As ever, everyone, please put your questions in the Q&A bubble below. We've got an hour of discussion among ourselves. And then at the end of the hour, if you want to stay on and give your thoughts, please do so when we say goodbye to our panelists. I'm going to start with David, because I think we need a bit of a reminder, even if you're in the UK or if you're in Australia or the US. I think it's worth David reminding us why when Boris Johnson speaks, he doesn't speak for the whole United Kingdom, although he is the leader of Her Majesty's government in the United Kingdom Parliament. So David, just give us a background. Why is that the case and how has that evolved?
I'll try and do this briefly. The backstory is, like many aspects of the British Constitution, very deep and very long. But basically, what is now the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland is the sum of its parts. You have the Anglo-Welsh Union, an enforced union, if you like, in the 16th century. You have the more negotiated union between England and Wales, generally considered as England, and Scotland in 1707. Then you have another union between the Great Britain formed from England, Scotland, and Ireland in 1801. And then you have a truncation to that union in 1921, when most of Ireland secedes to form the Irish Free State and now the Republic of Ireland. Now, the UK was never a completely unitary state, i.e. Everything was dictated from London or Westminster. All of those unions retained aspects of autonomy within different parts of the UK. So in Wales, there was the language dimension and churches and so on contested at various points. In Scotland, famously, the legal system, education, and a separate church survived the union in the early 18th century. And in Ireland, in the 19th century, you had a separate administration, if not an independent parliament. And then Northern Ireland in 1921 had devolution for half a century, so it had a parliament and a prime minister of its own. And that was obviously ended with the Troubles in the early 70s. But the point is that the UK has never been uniform. It's never been completely unitary. But the crucial development in this regard, in the modern context, was the formal devolution of power in the late 90s. So a Northern Ireland Assembly was restored in that part of the UK, a Scottish Parliament was created in Edinburgh, and a National Assembly for Wales, now called the Welsh Parliament, was created in Cardiff. And all of those things reflected the history in those parts of the UK, as I've just set out, but also domestic demands for some degree of autonomy and control. So the UK became not a formally federal country, as in Australia, the United States, or Canada, where you have a formal division of sovereignty and power, and of course a written constitution, but nor is it a unitary state, say in the manner of France. But we're somewhere in between. We're a quasi-federal country. And so the UK government, currently led by Boris Johnson, has ended up being, if you like, the sort of federal government, as in Washington, DC, or in Canberra, in Australia, while in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, you have state-level government, if we can look at it in those terms, with defined powers in various bits of legislation. And those powers are not uniform between Scotland, Wales, England, and Northern Ireland. It varies a great deal. And it's a bit opaque and unclear and crucially contested. So in Scotland, the leaders of the Scottish state-level government, the Scottish National Party, want independence. In Northern Ireland, you have a curious sort of sharing of power between one party, Sinn Féin, which wants United Ireland, and another party, the Democratic Unionists, who want to retain the link with Great Britain. And so the union is contested.
The crucial thing in terms of what we're seeing today is that one of the key devolved powers, so in 1997, you've got the devolution on a scale we haven't perhaps seen before in if you think about Scotland and Wales. But health is the key thing, and that's the thing that really looms large now.
Yeah, so I was just about to say that certain events tend to highlight this slightly messy devolution settlement. Brexit was one of those, and now the coronavirus pandemic has sort of reminded everyone that this weird patchwork constitution exists. So public health is devolved in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Policing is devolved in Northern Ireland and Scotland, but not in Wales. So there you have the two main areas in which, lockdown rules, lockdown easing, and all of those things take on. But the interesting thing is, early on in the pandemic, you actually had a high degree of cooperation between essentially four different governments. The lockdown was imposed at the same time with basically the same rules. It was only a bit later, say two months into lockdown, that you started to see what we call divergence in terms of how the different administrations were handling that. And this led to lots of criticism of Boris Johnson for using the wrong language. So in broadcasts, he would refer to the UK or Britain, whereas in fact, in legal reality, a lot of the things he was describing, either to lockdown or to come more to the point to come out of lockdown, actually only applied to England. And so it was almost as if the Prime Minister himself was struggling a bit with a very messy, very asymmetric sort of constitutional terrain. And there is a political dimension that I can't comment on, but obviously when you have different layers of government, different layers of political authority, those institutions will be used as the parties who control them want to. But perhaps Magnus can talk a bit more about that.
Yeah.
And just for broader context, there are ongoing discussions in the UK about how to tidy up this slightly messy system. We have an informal network of intergovernmental relations. So there's a forum called the Joint Ministerial Committee, where the First Ministers of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and usually the Prime Minister of the UK, but at least a senior UK minister, will meet around the country. It usually sort of rotates between Edinburgh, Cardiff, Belfast, and London, supposedly to sort of reach agreement on issues of common concern, like global pandemics, like Brexit. But in fact, the Joint Ministerial Committee has just ended up highlighting points of deep, profound disagreement. Another thing we had last week was an internal market white paper from the UK government, which in short wants to replace the sort of legal architecture of the EU single market with something in the UK. You would think that was quite straightforward to guarantee, trade of flow and all the rest of it. But that in itself has become another constitutional battlefield because the Scottish government says it takes powers away from the Scottish Parliament. The Welsh government is unhappy with what it might impose on them in terms of state aid and subsidies. Northern Ireland is concerned about how that intersects with the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is an incredibly complex part of the withdrawal agreement, which effectively keeps Northern Ireland in the EU single market in some respects. So it will be in two single markets, which raises obvious difficulties. So all of this is ongoing, and I guess the broader observation is that coronavirus has not created these issues. It's simply highlighted them in another respect, just as Brexit did a few years ago, just as the Scottish independence did, the Scottish independence referendum did 2 years before that. And there are no easy solutions in sight. There was a review of intergovernmental relations initiated 2 years ago. It doesn't seem to have gone anywhere. Lord Dunlop, a former Conservative government minister, was commissioned to review how devolution operated in Whitehall in London. That was delivered 6 months ago and hasn't been published. So there's a sense of sort of stasis there of things have just sort of frozen. And coronavirus, of course, has delayed a lot of ongoing work in that respect.
David, that's a fantastic introduction and a really good reminder that it's as you just say, it's not just COVID. There's a constitutional background to this that makes it difficult in the first place. So perhaps one could say, to start with, it's not all Boris's fault. But having said that, Magnus, Nicola Sturgeon has had a very good pandemic, hasn't she? Can you just outline how she's managed to exploit this? I mean, because Boris has looked terrible, hasn't he?
Yeah, I think it's worth bearing in mind that actually the Scottish administration's record actually on handling the pandemic isn't perhaps as good as some people may think. Until recently, Scotland had about the third worst death rate per head of population of anywhere in the world. The difference is that Nicola Sturgeon has managed to connect with the Scottish public in a way that Boris Johnson certainly hasn't throughout the UK and definitely hasn't in Scotland.
Why is that? Just in terms of stylistically, why has she done a better job than he has?
I think she's trusted, but you can like her or dislike her, but she's trustworthy. Boris Johnson isn't trustworthy. I mean, the polling here would show, I think David attested to earlier, or mentioned it earlier on, that she's at +60, he's -40 in Scotland. Now, he's a divisive figure in England. He's even more divisive in Scotland. The Scottish government's record, as I said, hasn't been great. But since that break in May, when the messaging changed between the two administrations, the record in Scotland has definitely improved. And obviously Sturgeon has pushed that. She's been doing this daily briefing every day, looked straight down the barrel of the camera and spoken to those people, the viewers who were willing to listen to it. Johnson, obviously, he was ill, but many people would say, well, if you're going shaking hands with COVID patients and calling it a cold to begin with, you deserve to get ill. His continuing this rota of folk at the press conferences, telling, having the education secretary telling folk what to do didn't really go down particularly well. So the messaging that's come across from Nicola Sturgeon has been great. She has represented Scotland's fight against this, through thick and thin. That is something that Boris Johnson hasn't managed to do. Now, she's also benefited from just not being Boris Johnson, in that he is a deeply unpopular figure here. He's in Scotland today, but you wouldn't really know it. You might as well. He's flown into RAF Lossiemouth, but he really can't go out in public here. As I said, he's divisive in England. He's even more divisive in Scotland. It's about 60 years ago this year, since Elvis Presley arrived at Prestwick Airport, right? And at the time, the police had to try and keep crowds away from Prestwick because all his admirers turned up. Boris Johnson's at Lossiemouth, another there's a RAF base as Prestwick was in those days, I think. And the difference is that I think Alison Rowett was writing in the Herald today. She's a columnist up here, working for the paper I used to work for. She says, you know, when Elvis passed through large crowds turned up when Elvis passed through Prestwick, but Boris Johnson really isn't a prince of rock and roll. He's a blimpish old Etonian, and that's the big difference. He doesn't play well up here. He grates with many people, and for him, being the leader of an English nationalist party, as I said to you earlier on, is a real issue. You're an English nationalist up against a Scottish nationalist. Well, the Scottish electorate would appear to be preferring the Scottish version of that. The polls are showing that. And as I said, Sturgeon's ability to communicate has been much, much stronger than his. As you said, actually look at the figures, and the death toll has been very poor here. Mistakes were made, certainly in the beginning. She would say that the sage advice was being shared throughout the UK. They initially followed that as well up here. But as time has moved on, the perception has been that the Scottish government, and particularly her, have handled this outbreak better. Yeah. And let's not forget Dominic Cummings. He really did damage the government's cause. And, you know, time moves on. But that will come back to haunt Boris Johnson still, I think. Maybe we'll discuss that later on. But she could point... We had a similar problem with the chief medical officer up here, but she went within a day of that story breaking. Dominic Cummings refused to go, and you can argue the rights and wrongs of that, but it will be a cross to bear for the government, I think, for some time to come.
Just as a reminder for perhaps people who might not know who Dominic Cummings is, if you're in the US or Australia, Dominic Cummings is the sort of eminence grise, who both was a sort of brains behind the Brexit campaign, and then is seen as being very close to Boris Johnson. And he famously took a trip took his family when he and his wife were ill to Durham, or near Durham, and apparently drove 50 miles to Bernard Castle, a wonderful tourist attraction in the northeast, apparently to test his eyesight. Prompted numerous cartoons. So, Melanie, is all of that, Magnus, what Magnus has been saying, is that fair? I mean, we were speaking earlier about the clear mistakes that the government has made, and maybe you could touch upon that. But also, Boris is a libertarian, isn't he? He hates overseeing these kind of rules, doesn't he?
Yes, I think that's absolutely crucial. The initial response to lockdown was to put it off for as long as possible. And I think that's squarely to do with Boris's libertarian impulses. I mean, the Cheltenham races were rather wonderful in a way, because the incidence of cross-infection must have been absolutely enormous, but it was also a symbol of a sort of plucky spirit. But the thing to remember is that the UK as a whole, and certainly Boris's bit of it, England, had an advantage of about a fortnight over countries like Italy, and that fortnight really wasn't properly used. There was that time when they could have taken precautionary measures, ramped up the provision of protective equipment for health workers, and done an early lockdown, and I think crucially it introduced restrictions on overseas travel, that is to say travellers coming into the UK from abroad. There was a report about 3 weeks ago to suggest that about half the cases that came to the UK from outside came from Pakistan. Now, that was obviously a country that was problematic in terms of possible infection and healthcare within it. And countries like that should have been prevented from landing flights into Britain from at least a fortnight before the lockdown on the 23rd of March. So the advantage that Boris had in terms of timing, he squandered. And I think that you're right in attributing that reluctance to lockdown to that libertarian impulse and that sort of sense that we're not going to be brought low by a blood virus. And in fact, he himself was brought low. And I take on board what Magnus said about rather rashly going around shaking hands with everybody he met. But it did have that unexpected bonus, which was that if people weren't taking the virus entirely seriously before Boris was laid low, they feeling well did afterwards. The best single thing that Boris Johnson did in terms of the coronavirus was to catch it, in that everybody took things seriously. Once it was apparent that the Prime Minister of the UK was actually at death's door, the thing could have gone either way. So he did actually everybody a service there. Right. But in terms of the division that we've been talking about already between the UK and England, it is actually tricky because a lot of the fiscal and economic stimulus that was terrifically important as a response to the virus, and I'm sure we'll come to this later, wasn't administered on a nation-state basis. It was done on a UK basis. The furlough scheme, which was huge in terms of expenditure, that's been done on a UK basis. And in terms of foreign responses to the pandemic here, that were rather in the UK, the United Kingdom has been dealt with by foreign governments as an entity because it's impossible for them to disentangle one bit of the union from another. For instance, in Ireland, there's a very interesting situation at the moment whereby flights are banned from Britain in the sense that you're obliged to go into quarantine for a fortnight after you arrive. And that's precisely what I'm doing at the moment. Whereas anybody who goes into that bit of the UK, which is also part of Ireland, doesn't have any restrictions. So obviously you're going to have some people heading for Belfast and then going south to Dublin. So everything that we've been saying is obviously true, that the nation states are different in the response to the outbreak and also the incidence of it. But there is the difficulty from outside of trying to deal with the UK as anything but a single entity.
I'm going to follow up on that with just a couple of comments on Wales and Northern Ireland. I was speaking to Peter Stead, who's a professor at Swansea University, now retired, and he's a frequent commentator on Welsh politics. And he was saying that what's certainly true because of COVID is that all of us in the UK are far more aware of the devolved nature of the UK as a result of this, because you've seen the devolved administrations being far more prominent. So in Cardiff, you've seen the First Minister Drakeford coming out every day, almost giving us a State of the Nation address. And he was also, Peter Stead was saying that the media coverage within Wales has been obviously focused very much on health and care, and as though the whole of the economy is basically about health and care. So there's this impression, I think, health itself has really dominated everyone's minds, and that has played into the devolved powers that the administrations have. So it's partly, he's basically saying that if you look at news coverage in Wales, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the economy has got no relevance at all. The UK being, as you were saying, Melanie, just now, and its powers to distribute money and wealth creation just doesn't figure at the moment within the debate. So it's been marginalised.
The thing is that, sorry to break in, but in terms of the coverage of the pandemic in England and London, where I was, you had Matt Hancock, in effect, speaking for the English side of the response, and Boris attempting to delegate that aspect of the thing to Matt Hancock as Health Secretary. And then he himself, I think, was seeking to speak as Prime Minister for the United Kingdom. So Boris never presented himself simply as having responsibility merely for England. He always had the prime ministerial aspect as being representative as the country as a whole. And it was poor old Matt Hancock who had to shoulder the blame for everything that's gone wrong in England in terms of the response to the pandemic.
Yeah,
but there has obviously been confusion there as well in that, and there's certainly something that's picked up by folk in Scotland, when Johnson talked about changing the message in early May, he didn't make it clear it only applied to England. So the nationalists, who are always campaigning, despite what they say, Nicholas is always campaigning, they jump on this and say, that's it, once again, you're basically ignoring Scotland, etc., etc. And people do pick up on that. And the Scottish Affairs Select Committee has a report out today, and I think Alistair Jack, the Scottish Secretary, said, I think he admits that Sturgeon was told of the impending change in this core message, but wasn't told what the change would be.
I want to stand back a bit now and just look at the broader debate about basically what happens to the UK in the future. And there are these two, with COVID is the currents of pressure at the moment, and the other thing that David was talking about was Brexit. The next year there are elections in Scotland. The SNP is clearly using that as a platform to demand another referendum on independence. Magnus, do you think that's going to happen?
I think it probably will, for right or wrong. The election in May next year, the polls will show the SNP will do well at it. Now, there's other things coming up, like an inquiry into the Alex Salmond affair, which some of you may be aware of, which could undermine the SNP. But as things stand, and currently, obviously, the coronavirus pandemic is still forefront in everybody's minds. And as we've already mentioned, Nicola Sturgeon is regarded, rightly or wrongly, to have handled this crisis particularly well. The polls show that the SNP, there's 129 seats at the Holyrood Parliament. It would appear that, as things stand, the SNP will get about 74 of those. But coming up on the rails is a plan to launch another nationalist party called the Alliance Party, which would stand. The Parliament has constituencies and then regional seats. The Alliance Party would stand in the regional seats, which traditionally have tended to, in recent years, gone to non-independent supporting parties. The Alliance would only stand in those seats. So what you could end up with is, out of the 129 seats, about 110 seats taken up by parties demanding independence. Now, it'd be very interesting if the Prime Minister then still refuses to grant a referendum then, because certainly the SNP and the other independent supporting parties will say they've got a mandate for it, and it will, the election will be seen as a referendum on whether or not to have a referendum or not. It will. Yeah. The SNP will make sure that happens.
Yeah, we had a problem there with Melanie, but she's back now, and I think Melanie.
Good.
So that's all good.
Yeah.
That's just Magnus. We were talking about the possibility, Melanie, of a Scots referendum next off the back of elections next year. I'm going to come to you in a second just to ask you a question about that. But before that, just coming back to Magnus, what was I going to say? I'm just losing my train of thought there.
The elections, and
yeah,
do we have another referendum or not?
Yeah.
There's also the question in Ireland, because there's been some discussion about the possibility of an Irish border pool as well, and I'm sure we'll come on to that. But that's come up today in the context of possible Russian interference in the poll, because it was suggested that if a Scottish referendum would be fair game for Russian interference, then so too would an Irish border pool. So that's come back on later.
That's very interesting. Well, interestingly, Alex Salmond, who some of you may have heard of, was on Russia Today, on RT today.
That's interesting.
With his programme, and basically he was saying Northern Ireland should cut ties with the UK and join the Republic, which, so he's not been cowed by the recent heat that's been put upon Russian involvement in British affairs. And as I hinted earlier, he will be subject of a parliamentary inquiry in Scotland starting next month. But he's certainly not cutting his ties with Russia as things stand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the point I was going to make was that just a couple of years ago, the Conservatives had made a huge sort of comeback in Scotland.
Yes.
And Magnus, really the point you're making is that Brexit has turned the Conservative Party really from being a sort of, an all-union party, the Conservative and Unionist party, to
Yes.
what you call an English nationalist party. Just for people who don't fully understand, why that might be the case, can you just explain why conservatism has become so poisonous north of the border and possibly elsewhere?
It's been regarded as poisonous, rightly or wrongly, possibly since Mrs. Thatcher deindustrialised the UK. The deindustrialisation, and Scotland was very reliant on heavy industry, as we know. She accelerated that decline. Now, many people in Scotland claim she picked on Scotland more than anywhere else. I always say, well, go to Sunderland, go to Liverpool, and I think you'll find she wasn't terribly popular there either.
Rolled out the poll tax north of the border
but
first.
She rolled out the poll tax first as well, and that didn't help, and that certainly played into the hands of opponents, and that really helped set the wheels in motion for devolution, really. And what happened after that, a brief history lesson. I'm not David Torrance, but bear with me. With devolution, what then happened was that the Tories were struggling. They didn't get many seats, as they weren't going to do, because then the number of Tory seats in the 1950s, the majority of MPs were Conservative in Scotland, but that declined rapidly with the end of empire and the decline in heavy industry. Labour became dominant, and really Labour dominated Scottish politics for 50 years. And really, if you ever came to Glasgow in the days when Labour were at its pomp, as I'm sure some of you did, it was the worst kind of sort of corrupt pork barrel politics you would get, really sort of misogynistic, brutish. And Labour took that support for granted, really. So when devolution came along, they continued to really concentrate on Westminster. So the setting up of the Holyrood Parliament, unbeknownst to them, is effectively a Trojan horse for the SNP. Labour's greatest talents still sought their fame and fortune in London. The pool of talent, especially after the death of Donald Dewar, the first minister for Scotland, was really poor. It's a very shallow pool of talent that Labour had to offer to the Scottish electorate. Alex Salmond recognised that. Alex Salmond is a very canny man. He recognised that devolution, especially as presented by the Labour Party, presented a vacuum for the SNP to step into. And he did that very, very effectively. The SNP hadn't done particularly well until he arrived at Holyrood, and he took the fight to the Labour establishment. And in the space of about 3 or 4 years, basically eviscerated Labour in Scotland, and they've never been able to recover from that. And so what you've got is, if you're regarded as a patriotic social democrat or more left-leaning in Scotland, basically, you've got one place to go in many people's eyes, and that is to support the SNP. Now, Labour have failed to articulate a case for the union, especially since Gordon Brown left Downing Street. You've had Ed Miliband, who's regarded as a London intellectual, Jeremy Corbyn, who was just regarded as somebody who had no relevance to Scotland whatsoever. And so the real issue for the political debate here, one is, what can the Tories do? Now, the question you asked, Nick, was, what has happened? Well, Brexit happened. So we had the referendum in 2014 up here, which was very divisive, and then you had the surge in membership of the SNP after that, mind you, the 2015 Scottish election, which the SNP did very well. But the whole debate is being supercharged here by Brexit. And I think many of the electorate here saw, as I said earlier, effectively the Tory party morphing into an English nationalist party. And you look at what Johnson and his cohorts have done since Johnson became Prime Minister. He has supercharged that English nationalism, really, in many ways. If you look at the Brexiteers he's brought on board, that doesn't play very well in Scotland, where the government is always campaigning, and the government is a Scottish nationalist government. And Labour, Labour, as I said, Labour are ineffectual. They failed to articulate what the union stands for. And Keir Starmer will have to change his stance, I think, if they want to have a chance.
This all may sound like inside baseball if you're listening from abroad.
Sorry.
I mean, this is all really serious stuff. The UK could break up. The country
Yes.
that I identify myself as being British. I live on the Welsh border. Actually, Magnus comes from the same area that
Absolutely. I missed it a great deal.
Yeah. He knows our pub, our local pub, very well.
Horseshoe's very good. I'd recommend it.
Yeah. And this is a serious prospect. The UK could break up, and that matters to me, enormously. And it'll have a significant impact, I think, on international affairs if it does happen. Maybe, who knows what's going to happen. Melanie, we were speaking earlier. You were saying you think that Boris should try and oppose a referendum in Scotland, come what may. Magnus has been saying that's just not going to be possible.
Well, it is in the gift of Westminster whether to hold a referendum or not. I mean, you might not like it, but that's the reality. And he'd be absolutely mad to have a referendum unless he's absolutely certain about the outcome. Never have a poll, never have a consultation unless you know the outcome you want and you're likely to get it. And David Cameron just got that wrong in terms of Brexit. And that was because he was so detached from his own grassroots, I think, and was just tone deaf, except to the people that he wanted to hear. So I think that both in Scotland and in Northern Ireland, you can't force the government's hand. What you can do is just keep up the effort. But if the Scottish government are in the vanishingly unlikely event that Sinn Féin were to take over entirely in Northern Ireland, the issue were forced and the devolved governments were to hold a poll, all the Westminster government need do is tell unionists just to boycott the whole thing, and then the outcome would be null and void. It would be Catalonia and then some.
Yeah, that's a fair point. But the difference between the Brexit vote, where Cameron got things wrong, was that there was no demand for a referendum. If you look at all the polls prior to Cameron announcing the referendum, there was no great demand except within the Tory party. And then
Well, there was, in the sense that UKIP did kind of win swinging victories in terms of the European elections.
But European elections
was a factor. It's just completely from, this was the United Kingdom Independence Party, and its sole object and reason for being was to take Britain out of the European Union. And in terms of fulfilling its objective, it's a single most successful political outfit, I think, that contemporary politics has actually seen. But UKIP, although it's vanished completely from the radar now, was prior to the referendum a really significant force. And in the European elections, it did have such a lead that it did give it some sort of credibility in democratic terms. And I suppose David Cameron felt that he had to respond to that. It may have been a mistake, but it was a legitimate mistake.
It was definitely a mistake, wasn't it, I think? But the issue is that if you look at the polling, it showed that when you asked the British electorate, and particularly the English electorate, what their priorities were, Europe came very, very, very low on that. Now, obviously, the European elections could be seen as a protest vote. And obviously, Nigel Farage, the leader of the UKIP party at the time, played to fears on immigration and things like that. But it's only after Cameron announced the referendum did all of a sudden Europe rise to the very top of people's political concerns. The difference in Scotland is that the demand will be there. And the demand's there now, really, from up to a sizable number of the electorate. The demand is already there for a second referendum, whether you agree with it or not. That will only increase as things stand come the elections in May here next year. And Johnson will be in a real bind if he continues to say no when you've got potentially 85% of all the seats at the Holyrood Parliament taken up by politicians demanding it and making a very strong case for it, as they will be able to. It will be in their manifestos, etc., etc. He will be in a really difficult position if he continues to say no. And who knows what will happen after that, if he does do that. Obviously, he'll also be facing an inquiry into his handling of the COVID of the pandemic, which might not be terribly flattering either. So, I mean, it'll be great for the likes of you and me, Melanie, because it does give us, what the material we thrive on. But as Nicholas said, in terms of the future for the UK, there's everything to play for, really, I think. And Brexit, I would argue, is what has caused that. And the tectonic plates shifted in 2016 sizably once the Brexit vote came through, and shifted again when Johnson became Prime Minister.
We can come on to Brexit again in a moment to see how that accelerated that process with the dispute about what happens to the powers being returned from Brussels to the UK and how much of those powers should go to the devolved nations, because that's the additional fodder for the argument. You lot, you've got to start asking questions. I can only see one from the indomitable Simon Jackson, so I need a bunch more questions, and so we can open those questions up and bring your microphones in. Melanie, just before we start doing that, the people in England increasingly don't care about Scotland. They certainly never cared about Northern Ireland, and the Welsh. Well, we've got a fairly disparaging attitude towards the Welsh as well. So, we're going to break up, and who cares?
Well, the Labour Party cares. I mean, once you kind of lose Scotland, their chances of getting back into office are vanishingly small. So you have at least one sizable political constituency there. But I think you underestimate the sentimental appeal of the Union to the Conservative and Unionist Party. I mean, obviously, from the Tories' sectarian point of view, it would be fine just to have England minus the troublesome elements up in Scotland, but they could be guaranteed a majority in perpetuity. But there is, I think, right across the board, an extraordinarily fundamentalist feeling for the Union, and I think it runs right through from Brexiteers to the kind of liberal wing of the Conservative Party, that they are fundamentally unionist. And I don't think that's going to change, even though the outcome would indeed be to their advantage in Westminster. It is one of the curious aspects of this that that England feel far more warmly towards Scotland than vice versa. The other thing is that a lot of the growth or the revival in Tory fortunes, and certainly in terms of the Brexit debate, has been in the Red Wall constituencies, which are those northern seats which voted very strongly for Brexit and feel quite strongly about issues like immigration, but are working class areas. Magnus referred to them in terms of being some of the casualties of the Thatcher government. And you don't have an homogenous England in this regard. You've got London, and everybody hates London, but you've got a fragmentation outside that. And in terms of the north of England, and especially the northeast of England, you do have a kind of resurgent kind of feeling that their interests haven't been taken into account in all these debates, because when it comes to sort of regional aid and so forth, far more attention is going to be given to the devolved parts of the UK rather than to the regions like the north of England. They seem to have no inclination at all to have any kind of self-government on their own part, but there is that feeling that they have been disenfranchised and left out of account when it came to trying to revive the fortunes of parts outside London.
Right, we've got some really good questions coming in now. So I'm Magnus, save your thoughts for a second.
Okay.
Let's bring in Anna Logan, because we just want to clarify one thing. So if I can bring Anna on board. Anna, go ahead, Anna. Just check your microphone. Anna, just check your microphone, and you should be with us. Anna, you just got to, there you go. Anna, you should be able to talk now, Anna. Pause, no. If I can't get Anna's microphone on board, I'm going to ask her question for her, which I can see here. Anna, are you there?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Go on.
For those of us who don't know or have forgotten, what is the salmon affair?
Magnus.
Oh God, right, okay. Alex Salmond was the former First Minister of Scotland, and by far the biggest beast in the Scottish independence movement for the last 30 years. Very powerful, charismatic, divisive figure. And he stood down as the First Minister of Scotland in 2014 after the referendum vote. He then became an MP and stood at Westminster. was quite a divisive figure there, because he wasn't leader of the party there. He's a guy who likes to be centre stage. And I could, to simplify things, a year or so ago, complaints were made about his conduct, and he was accused of sexual assault against numerous women who'd worked with him. The trial was held in March this year, and he was found not guilty on all charges. He now claims that he has been the victim of a politically inspired witch hunt led in parts by the civil service, but also in part by effectively by Nicola Sturgeon and her cohorts within the SNP, who want to get rid of a guy they feel has become a bit of an albatross around their necks. So the inquiry that I mentioned earlier on will start in August, which will look at the civil service handling of the allegations made against him. It could be very entertaining, put it that way.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you very much for that, Anna. And I think you, in actual fact, because you were on the Scottish tour before that referendum, and I don't know if you were with us on, because there were 2 tours we did, and we did see Alex Salmon speaking in Edinburgh on the stage, and I clearly remember him laying into the English press very sarcastically at the time, and it was quite uncomfortable. I thought I wouldn't like this guy to be my leader.
Yes, I was delighted to see David tonight.
Yes, no, exactly.
Oh, he doesn't like it. He hates David Torrance.
Yeah.
Really?
The Scots Nationalists actually ran an advertising campaign with a guy called Davy, who was an independent skeptic, and it was basically focused on David. And David had a really tough time. He had a lot of sort of vile thrown his way, and it was he had a particularly difficult time. Simon Jackson, let's start off with you, and then we've got a lovely flow of questions to come afterwards. So Simon Jackson, go ahead.
Hi. It's very easy to fall into the trap of assuming that those with whom we profoundly disagree are stupid. But the parallels between the UK secession from the EU and Scotland from the UK seem so blindingly obvious that I'd be interested in the panelists' views on how Boris would seek to argue to delink them, were he not so infuriatingly adept at dodging difficult questions.
Melanie, you've got to take that one. Melanie, go on.
Well, yes, he is adept at dodging difficult questions, and I think on this one, he can simply refuse to play ball. The issue of he reverts to again and again is that the last referendum was meant to be a once-in-a-generation affair, and the SNP did engage in it on that basis. And so he can simply dig in his heels and say, okay, we're not a generation in yet, so terribly sorry, we're just going to make the best of it as it is. So there's absolutely nothing that anybody can do, as far as I can see, to change that. As Magnus says, there can be the moral authority of a resounding vote for the SNP. And that can be done on the same basis as Boris went into the election. The last UK election was effectively a vote on Brexit, because Boris's one slogan was "Get Brexit done." And when the SNP goes into this election, it will presumably be on the basis of we want another referendum, and thereby turning the election into something of a poll on whether people want that or not. So I think that's the only way that you could actually bring any kind of moral force to bear on Boris in this respect. But so far as the practicalities are concerned, there is simply nothing you can do to force his hand.
I'm just going to follow up on that, and before we go to Magnus, we'll take a question from Philip Godfrey. I mean, this, Melanie, forgive me for saying so, that just seems like an absurd argument. We're just not going to listen to you, and we're not going to do anything, and everything's going to be fine. I was reading Ben Judah the other day, saying that nobody's making a convincing case for the union. You know, there are enormous cases for the union, and we just don't seem to hear about it.
Well, you hear about us as a referendum. I mean, what was striking in the last referendum was that the thing got very, very specific very quickly once there was the real prospect of Scotland seceding. Those issues about whether you want two currencies within one land unit were brought very much to the fore. And I think that's going to remain a difficult issue.
Yeah.
Were Scotland to reapply for entry to the European Union, it must now be done on the basis of accepting the euro. Do you actually want two currency areas within one Latin landmass? You've got it in Ireland with obvious practical difficulties. Do you actually want the same thing in Scotland and with a functioning border? I think what was good about the last referendum was its incessant focus on those practicalities. And I think that were there to be another poll, that's exactly what would happen again.
Yeah. I think the issue again is now, though, that Brexit, obviously we'll get the great Brexit deal we're going to get in December, where we're all going to be clapping hands and finding out that it's all been terribly simple and we've really taken back control. You know, many people we'll wait and see what comes of that in December. The SNP will be certainly waiting for it to see what it delivers. Making the case, as Melanie said, and as the chapter said earlier on, there's obviously a disconnect. You know, Johnson has argued for one thing. He's going to find it hard to then argue for another. He appealed to people's hearts, you know, with the Brexit debate. We all know that some of the claims he made basically were fundamentally untrue. And the electorate, it was a protest vote. Now, you could argue you're going to get the same protest vote up here, you know, when it comes down to the election next year, and then possibly, if it happens, a referendum vote. If, you know, the arguments that can be made about, you know, if you look at polling in the Tory party, 49% of, you know, it's a Conservative Unionist party, 49% of members now to say, get rid of Scotland, we don't care. Now, if I was Boris Johnson, I'd be very, very concerned about that, because the thing that will be carved on his gravestone will be, he's a Prime Minister who lost the UK. Never mind Brexit, that'll be secondary at the end of the day, like George III, the king who lost America. With that comes a collapse in international standing. So we currently have the 5th biggest economy in the world. Well, you cut 10% out of that, we'll fall down to sort of 15th or something like that, possibly. Where do you put the nuclear submarines? I don't know. Maybe in France, potentially. That won't go down particularly well. There are that sort of appeal, which I'm not sure has really been brought home to those core Tory members who, the Tory party has drifted further to the right and has become increasingly alien to many people in Scotland. And that is a real concern for Johnson, I think.
Philip Godfrey.
Hi, Nicholas, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm always a bit confused when I look at the union issue, and I'm very neutral on this. I should preface my remarks by saying that. But I listened to, a couple of months ago, the nurses in Northern Ireland went on strike, I think, for the first time, and it was quite a big issue, complaining about the lack of funding for the health service in Northern Ireland. I crunched the numbers and quickly realised that there's a disproportionate amount of funding that goes into the Northern Ireland Health Service. What Northern Ireland suffers from is a massive fiscal deficit. And I think to a degree, my perception would be that is true of the Scots as well. And I'd be interested in the panel, because that sounds like it's going to be a little bit of a corrective to all of the fervour and excitement for the dissolution of the union, because who's going to pay for it all? Sinn Féin must be, if I can use a colloquialism, shitting themselves at the prospect of unification with Northern Ireland. Disgusting.
Marty Ryan had a question as well. I just wanted to say that Marty Ryan as well. So I think, Marty, your question's been covered here too. Go on, Melanie.
Right. Can I just pick up one small aspect of this, which is that the situation in respect of Northern Ireland is exactly as you describe, but they weren't proposing that Northern Ireland should go to alone. What Sinn Féin are proposing is unification with the rest of the island, to have a 32-county island, which has always been the objective. And so you'd be joining forces with actually a relatively robust small economy, rather than attempting to justify Northern Ireland's existence as a 6-county unit, which frankly was never remotely viable.
I did see there was a congressional report into this issue, which I had a read of recently, and they said there were great synergies to be had between Northern Ireland and Ireland, and there would be a peace dividend of sorts. I wasn't 100% convinced by it. I do take your point, but in the round, what do the panelists feel about this fiscal issue and how that plays to the nationalist parties in Scotland and Ireland? I don't know about Wales.
Magnus.
Well, the fiscal issue, I mean, obviously that, as Melanie rightly pointed out, that became a dominant theme within the referendum debate in 2014, you know, the requirement possibly to set up a central bank and the need to therefore cut public spending hugely. My intuition tells me that the Brexit vote has shown to some people at least that voters are willing to vote to make themselves poorer. Now, they don't see it that way, especially the constituencies in the north of England. They, again, use Brexit as a protest vote. But, I mean, there's people in Ashford and Kent complaining about the building of the great big lorry car park that I'm going to get because of the hold-ups that potentially will be caused by cross-channel traffic. They voted for that. Now, my guess is that obviously, if we do have a second referendum in Scotland, once again, rightly, opponents of independence will hammer away at these very real problems that will exist with, you know, the creation of a central bank. What currency do you use? You know, sterlingization means you're following in the slipstream of England. Do you want to do that? Okay, you wait to join the euro potentially. Well, that could take years. The Spaniards wouldn't be welcoming that necessarily, or the Belgians or the Italians. But if you look at where the SNP was when the referendum campaign started here in 2013, really, they were 25% in the polls. They got to within a hair's breadth of gaining independence. Now, they're now at 54% in the polls. So they're a lot closer to gaining what they want anyway. Now, so the argument that was made last time by Alistair Darling, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, who then led the No campaign against Scottish independence, will have to be even stronger this time to try and counter that. What they're up against is Brexit, where 62% of the Scottish electorate voted against it and felt they're being dragged out of Europe by English nationalists. That has given the SNP a grievance they didn't really have before. And that is going to be very difficult to counter. And who's going to lead the No campaign this time?
Yeah.
You know, Boris Johnson, if that vote does happen, Boris Johnson is going to have to look very hard to find somebody who's willing to put themselves up for what would frankly be an absolutely thankless task.
Yeah, yeah. So let's bring in...
one possibility, sorry. One possibility might be the one you referred to earlier, Gordon Brown.
Go on. Can I, Melanie,
Possibly, absolutely, that's fair.
We're running out of time. We're running out of time here. So can I bring in Caroline Sumnall and then Peter Glanville straight off the back of each other? I think, Caroline, part of your question has been answered because of the question of the Brexit, but I think more generally, I think you've touched something we can talk about at length, but we'll try and deal with quickly. Caroline, quickly, and then Peter.
So I'm English, even though I voted in, but I have always been completely baffled by the strength of animosity of Scots against the English. I know the history, and I'm interested to know your perspectives on that, because it feels like it doesn't go the other way. And why is that? And at this point, frankly, I think some English people are feeling fine, go. Because it's rude.
Yeah. Peter Glanville. Peter? No, he's not there. So, Pete, I'm going to ask this question for him. And Pete says, if Ruth Davidson returns to frontline politics in Scotland, would that make a difference? Would it make a difference to the Tories? I think those two questions directed at Magnus, and then we'll have to wrap up after that.
Yeah. Well, Ruth Davidson won't be returning to Scottish politics as long as Boris Johnson's Prime Minister. So we could forget that. She was a bulwark in many ways against the SNP and projected a vision of Tory unionism that many people liked. She did it with wit. What you now have is the Tory party in Scotland totally attached to the Johnson project. So that's going to be a real problem for them. In terms of the previous question about why do the Scots hate the English so much, Nicola Sturgeon would say they've always, the nationalists have always put forward a case of sort of civic nationalism. And so she distances herself very much from that sort of blood and guts nationalism that is so poisonous in other parts of the world. You could argue, why do people, you go to Glasgow, half of Glasgow hates the other half of Glasgow. You've got the sectarian divide there. You speak to people in Yorkshire, they hate Lancastrians. It's, you speak to people anywhere north of Watford, they all hate people in London. So it is, all these differences are all below the surface.
But there isn't English domination of our society and our politics. So if you're in Scotland, I mean, my family's partly in Scotland as well. It's incredibly irritating to them to hear assumptions made. If you're talking about the BBC, it might be focused on English cricket. It might be, laws that, there's no consideration. I think the BBC's got a lot better at this kind of thing, but
yes,
inbuilt into us. And many people, when they talk about,
that's existed for years. So if you looked at those the obituaries for Jack Charlton, right? Okay, look at those pictures, 1966, when England won the World Cup. Look at the flags. There were Union flags people were waving. That wouldn't happen now. Something has fundamentally changed in the past 55 years.
It's interesting you bring up Jack Charlton.
Sorry?
Go on, Melanie.
Sorry, it's interesting you bring up Jack Charlton because he was the quintessential Englishman who took over the Ireland football squad. And there is nobody more popular in Ireland than this particular Englishman. So being English need not be an impediment to being liked in other parts of the British Island within the UK. Boris's particular problem, I think, is a class problem because his demeanour is so very much the old Etonian. That brings back all kinds of atavistic responses to being run again by the English ruling classes, and it may be completely at odds with reality, but I'm afraid those instinctive responses do come to the fore at times like this.
Yeah, I want to give Isabel, my colleague, a chance to chip in and ask a question if she wants to, and she's going to be surprised by me mentioning a name because she usually sits there very quietly and listens to us all. But Isabel, have you got any questions? You or Dave, if you're sitting there? Quiet, silence, no response there. Okay, we'll move on to it. I think we're going to wrap up, but Magnus and Melanie, do you have any sort of final thoughts, anything you just want to add?
Well, I would say, things can change, definitely. So, I mean, we're moving into the health crisis for the time being is beginning to ebb. And I think that we are entering the economic crisis. Now, who knows what's going to come out of that? Obviously, we had the 2008 financial crash, which led, in many people's eyes, to Brexit, Donald Trump, things like that. This is going to be worse than that. So it'll be very interesting to see what comes of it. Up here in Scotland, we also have, as you said, the elections, and we also have this inquiry into this SNP crisis, which could potentially come from the Alex Salmond affair, which I described earlier. So there's still, whilst I've said, a referendum looks, very likely, which I still believe it will, there's still a lot can happen. This pandemic, is going to be with us for a long time yet, and we don't yet know there'll be unforeseen circumstances, but we know there's going to be a lot of pain to come, and quite how that plays, no one yet knows.
No, okay, very fair comment there. Melanie?
Yes, I think the pandemic will ebb, I think, after Christmas, once we start to have some sort of vaccine and the furlough scheme does come to an end, so life returns to something like the new normality. So I think that politics is in a way on hold at the moment, so we can't really project the present situation onto the future. But the handling of the pandemic will, I think, leave a residue of distrust and marginal alienation on the parts of some part of the UK, and certainly it hasn't, I think, enhanced the Prime Minister's reputation particularly.
Yeah, I will ask one last question here, and that's from Lynn Maddock in Australia. And she said, would the SNP run an illegal referendum like Catalonia? And what would happen if they did? Magnus?
I think that would be incredibly risky. If you have an indicative referendum like they ran in Barcelona or in Catalonia, well, I'm not sure the British state response would, seeing these likes of Alex Salmond or Nicola Sturgeon jailed or having to flee somewhere, I don't know where they'd go to, mind you. I think that, I don't really know. You have to wait and see what the public response would be to it. Scotland is split, obviously, between the people who support the union and not. Nicola Sturgeon is a very cautious politician. If she is still leader of the SNP after the election in May, and she gets a big majority, she will campaign for another referendum. She'll have to do that. There's already pressure for her to do that. I don't see her holding an illegal referendum. Now, I could be wrong, but she is innately cautious. But there'll be a risk of civil unrest if Boris Johnson continues to refuse it. We're having huge marches here, or were until the pandemic, demanding another referendum. They will only get bigger and bigger if he keeps on stonewalling demands for it.
Yeah. Well, listen, thank you both very much indeed. This has been a gripping discussion, and we're going to see things evolve over the next year. It's going to be fascinating to see what happens in Scotland next year. We will be running tours in Scotland. If you're interested in looking at what's going on in Scotland, we've got a very good team of people up there, and it might give you an opportunity to see Magnus as well.
You're very unlucky.
So that's all to look forward to. My thanks to Magnus Llewellin, to Melanie McDonagh, and also to David Torrance for their time. Just as a reminder, everyone, please stay on the line if you want to join the discussion afterwards. Our next discussion is on Tuesday, the 28th of July, and it's with Thomas Dvorak. It's a retrospective of his work. He is the president of Magnum, probably the world's most famous photo agency, and he's covered all of the major conflicts in recent times, and he's been looking at COVID and over the last few months. So that should be a really interesting discussion. That'll be at 12 p.m. UK time on Tuesday. So please do join us then.